Welcome to this episode of Safety Brainiacs. Today we're talking about high impact training skills. So how many of you have sat in a classroom and the trainer's pretty boring and the class is pretty boring? Today we're talking about how you can make your training more engaging, more interesting for your users, and when you do that, they're more likely to learn. So the first thing I want to share with you is a couple of facts. Did you know that some of these famous people were problem learners? For example, Albert Einstein and Edgar Allan Poe were actually expelled from school. Thomas A. Edison, the famous inventor, was bottom of his class. And George Bernard Shaw was labeled a bad speller. He's the famous author. So what's the point of all this? The point is, these were brilliant people. They were highly intelligent. They're some of the people that shifted our history, but yet they were labeled as bad spellers or bad students. Why? They probably didn't have a teacher that knew how to teach them. So here's a few tips that I want to share with you today. First, you have to care about the subject you're teaching about. If you don't care, you don't have an interest in it, it's kind of going to show up and you're going to seem pretty boring. When you are boring, your people are bored. And when they're bored, as we're going to talk about in a minute, they're not going to learn very much. Secondly, you have to have the desire to share knowledge. And you have to have obtained a basic minimum competence yourself in the subject matter material. So unfortunately, too often, and I'm sure you've seen it yourself, there's the trainers at the front of the room. They really don't want to be there. They're not that good at training, and they don't even know that much about the subject. So how can you expect the learner to actually want to learn? The second tip is to remember that your students or your learners are going to differ in how they learn based on their interests, their intelligence, their past experiences, their ability to concentrate, their memories, their imagination, their current state of well-being. If they're currently anxious because of something going on in their environment, they're not going to have a very good attention span, and their self-confidence. So these are all aspects of people that can really affect how they learn. So the best thing that you can do in your environment is create a relaxed environment, create a humorous environment, a light environment, be engaging. They're going to pick that up. Third tip is to remember that learning stops under these three conditions. They stop, number one, if they're confused. So if you provide subject matter material that's over and above their head and you lose them, they're going to stop learning. It's like when you read a complex book or newspaper article or something and you're not understanding it, you tend to just glaze over it, or you quit, or you move on, and then you don't understand the full concept. So you have to be aware of your class. If they look confused, you have to stop and bring those people along. If you don't, understand that the learning will stop. Secondly, they're going to stop learning if they're bored. So when I'm teaching high impact learning skills, I get my students to have a mirror, a hand mirror, and they actually have to look at themselves in the hand mirror, and I'll say, what do you see? So if they see a bored face looking back at them, that's you looking out to your participants. And if you're boring, they're going to be bored. Or said another way, if you're looking at the audience and they're bored, you're boring. So you've got to figure out a way to liven up your training. Maybe it's put in some videos. Maybe it's to tell some stories. Maybe it's to use inflection in your voice. Maybe it's to use great images. You have to give some spice to your training. Make sure it's not boring. Otherwise, they'll stop learning. They're going to go off in their mind and play golf or whatever they do in there. And the third time they're going to stop learning is if they get upset. So if people get into, say, a conflict in the room or a dialogue or an argument or disagreement about the theory that you're teaching, and you don't manage that effectively and people are upset for some reason, the brain is going to shut down the learning process. They're not going to learn. So this has happened to me before, where there's been some sort of confrontation or agitation in the classroom. Good time to take a break. Stop the learning. And there's one last tip that I'm going to give you today. Use a lot of questions in your learning and your teaching. Questions hook the mind. So lots of times as trainers, we just kind of do this verbal dump on people. We tell them. But actually using questions hooks the mind. So instead of telling them, the 5 steps for the 6 steps for lockout procedures, for example, rattling them off, you might say, who can tell me what are the steps for lockout? Even if they're not all in order, who can tell me? Or who can tell me what are the responsibilities of workers? Ask questions. And even when someone else in the class asks a question, the best thing you can do as a teacher, the dumber you are, the better teacher you are. Meaning that if somebody asks me a question, why is there a difference between federal and provincial legislation? I can either answer that question or I can say, oh, that's an amazing question. Does anybody else know the answer to that question? Why is there a difference between federal and provincial legislation? That's a really great trick because A, if you don't know the answer, it gives you time. B, it makes your teaching experience easier. C, it just makes you look pretty smart. And D, it gives the other people opportunity to interact in the classroom and they get to feel participating and really smart. So ask a lot of questions. Create your material to ask a lot of questions. So training is not about us, it's about getting our learners to learn. It's about putting them in an environment where they can learn. If the learner has not learned, the teacher has not taught. So everybody is teachable. We have to figure out how to teach them. We have to make an engaging, welcoming learning environment. We need humor for laughter. And remember that everybody learns differently and use a lot of questions. So that's this week's episode of Safety Brainiacs. If you'd like to know more about high impact training in your workplace, I am available. I work with organizations to help them with their high impact training. Visit my website at theoheineman.ca. If you wish to get more of these kinds of videos, please subscribe to our channel. Remember that a safety brainiac is an exceptionally intelligent person. Go out there, make great safety choices so that everybody goes home safe at the end of the workday and your business is protected.